Okay, afternoon everyone. So I'm going to do a quick little screencast from introduction to first paragraph, but I will go back to the introduction just to remind you of a couple of things, okay? Now, first of all, the whole idea of moving to the first paragraph is about zooming in on your argument, okay? The introduction is an overview, a global view, isn't it? It sets up the argument. It's a kind of zoom out. Now we're going to go into the actual increments of the argument, okay? I want to remind you that every paragraph begins with a topic sentence. Sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but the first sentence defines what the paragraph is going to be about. You should have one main idea in a paragraph, and the ideas that come underneath that should be subordinate ideas. Same thing with a quotation. I would urge you to have one main quotation and then supporting quotations later. In the topic sentence, I want you to directly address the question. This is why the words of the question are so important. Each time in each paragraph, you are signaling that you are on task and that you are looking up at the question that you've set yourself and answering that question, okay? Of course, the kind of analysis part of the sweaty paragraph or the peel paragraph is the granular detail. And that's why I say one quote where you go into a lot of detail. That might be form, it might be structure, it might be the connotations of the language, it might be even something like context. And I've spoken before about the importance of using a clincher sentence. If we're going to use the desk parlance, that's the why in sweaty, okay? Pulling that paragraph together and showing that it clearly addresses the question above. Okay, so from the introduction to first paragraph, what I want to remind you of. Let's not forget, we've started writing our introductions now, most of you have done that. So the introduction sets up the argument. It should have both a thesis and a counter-thesis, shouldn't it? It will also include, perhaps, some crucial context. So particularly if you have a question that has something about romanticism or modernism or something like that in, that gets defined very briefly in the introduction, okay? And then paragraph 1 becomes the first stage of the argument. Most of you will perhaps have 4 stages or 3 stages to your argument. I wouldn't go beyond 4 stages, 4 paragraphs, okay? So you need to think about that big question and what are the stages in order to answer that question. Let's have a look at one here. So here's a student's work. Does Eliot's poetry present modern life as entirely devoid of spirituality and meaning? You can see that's my kind of question. It's got the adverb in there, entirely. I like to put the adverb in so that you have something to argue against. 1 or 2 of you needed to change your titles, didn't you? Because they weren't strong enough statements. What does this one say? There are several threads to Eliot that Eliot spins to illustrate the poverty of modern life. Fragmentation, isolation, nihilism, and thanophobia. Principally, these themes can be traced to the same source, ebbing religiosity. Eliot spoke to a generation in desperate need of definition in war-torn post-Enlightenment Europe. A modernist, Eliot highlights the hedonism of the Jazz Age and the disarticulation of the city in deeply intimate terms. Here's the key. Nonetheless, there's your hedge. It would be reductive to suggest that Eliot views the path out of purgatory as insuperable. Arguably, even before his conversion to the Anglican faith in 1927, Eliot pits the pilgrim on a journey in search of the hand expert God. Yes, that's my boy Eliot, named after the poet T.S. Eliot. Now, I want to remind you, it's really important you're breaking down the title and the introduction, aren't you? So if we have a look at this question here, like many modernist writers, T.S. Eliot paints a picture of a world in permanent decline. You all know why we put the word permanent in there, don't you? So that it becomes an absolute statement, and that allows the hedge and the counter argument, doesn't it? So is it in decline? Yes. Isn't it, Aya? Is it in permanent decline, though? No, because Eliot is a deep Christian. He believes in rebirth, in resurrection, in regeneration of culture. So your thesis becomes, no, this is not correct because the potential for rebirth exists. That then establishes your line of argument, doesn't it? So you see, in this case, you would have a three-stage argument, wouldn't you? So in the introduction, you've already set up the stages of the argument. This one we've seen before. Rudyard Kipling's poetry glorifies conflict. How far do you agree that in a choice of Kipling's verse, the poet represents the glory of the conflict? Again, having an absolutely strong statement allows her to change and to qualify that, okay? Let's have a look then at how this happens, okay? In Kipling's The White Man's Burden, written in 1899, advocates for the colonial rule of the Philippine people, rallying troops and thus acting as an incitement of conflict. There's your topic sentence. There we see she puts Kipling at the front of the paragraph. I like that, because that then clearly has the first stage of the argument, but it puts the emphasis upon authorial craft, on what the writer's doing. I want to see the writer's name at least once in each paragraph, so that you're not just saying what they say, but how they say it, okay? Drawing upon principles of manifest destiny, the poem alludes to the God-ordained superiority of the white American to legitimize and advocate for imperialist American policies. Now, I don't need to read this whole paragraph for you to see that this is the thesis part of it, isn't it? This is, I'm agreeing with the title. Here is my evidence, okay? She's naming the relevant poems, isn't she? She's setting up the quotations very carefully, weaving them and giving them meaning and context. And we can see then she's then going to move, she's choosing very nice little quotes like sullen people, half devil, half child. These are quotations that she's going to be able to swag. Look here, she starts to talk about the sibilants in silent, sullen people, etc. So as we've said before, successful essays determine on choosing correct quotes, productive quotes, I call them. Quotes that you can really pick apart, particularly ones that can have multiple meanings. Moving on. Where am I? Okay. Don't forget that a really good paragraph ends with this clincher sentence. I go on about this a lot, but it pulls the paragraph together, as we've said, and it makes sure that the reader can then follow your argument. It sets up the next paragraph nicely, doesn't it? Okay? And it telegraphs the question. That's something I believe you use in history still, isn't it? Okay? Don't forget in the clincher sentence to reiterate or rephrase the question, some of the words of the question, okay? That shows that you're on task, doesn't it? So that was just a quick little sense of how you're going to move from the introduction, just to remind you, which is definitely the kind of zooming out in the introduction, into the zooming in, and this will be a particular stage in the argument where you provide some of the more granular detail, as I say. Hope that was useful.